Hey folks, welcome to Bare Mtn today. Today we're inside the classroom. We're going to learn some things about soil blocking, or at least things that we thought we learned. So let's get into it.
Okay. Hi. A few days ago, I put out a post on YouTube and on Instagram and asked, do you have questions about soil blocks? And I figured since we had a few that we'd already received from viewers on YouTube, and I wanted to know if there were any more questions, and I figured I'd get just a couple, but we got a lot of questions. And so we're kind of looking at it as there's sort of three main things that everybody wants to know about soil blocks. And the first one is, what's the pros and cons of soil blocking? What's the benefit of soil blocking? Is it worth the time to do it? And then they want to know about the mix. So why don't we start with...
What was the third one?
Bumping up and watering.
Okay.
So that will be another
So
one.
What we're going to do is split this kind of into at least two videos.
Right. Yeah, because we'd be here yammering all day. But what we want to first start out is, what's the pros and cons of doing this? What's our philosophy? And all of this is from our point of view. We're no experts. We're no professionals.
This has just been from personal experience.
Right.
And what we found with everything that has to do with growing things is there's multiple paths to the same destination.
Right.
So I think, what we're just trying to do here is just pass on what has worked in our context. So you got to view it from that standpoint. Don't view it as this is the recipe.
Or the only way.
Or the only way, because that's just not the way the world works.
Yeah, you have to tailor it to your farm, your family,
your context, your time, your resources, all that kind of stuff.
All of that stuff is important.
Right. So let's start with the first thing, which was
pros and cons.
The pros and cons and why we do what we do.
The benefit of soil blocks.
Right.
Is there a benefit?
Okay. I think maybe the first thing we need to do is kind of review some principles. This is just a general sense of principles we follow. And I thought maybe what we could do is I could draw just kind of an illustration that would maybe help, illustrate this a little more. So let's just take a look at the magical dry erase board. By the way, do take notes. There will be a test.
No, there won't be.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the dry erase board and let's take a look at that. Okay. We've got some principles that we like to follow. The first thing is, for us, as we looked at plants as, if you had the perfect soil to grow in and the plant germinated naturally by itself, and it had the optimum water with the optimum fertility, that the plant would express and grow its root system and its top to its nature. So if you think about it from the standpoint, every plant has its own set of dynamics when it comes to its root system. Some are a tap root, some are a fine web of netted roots, some are main roots with feeder roots off the side. So if you looked at, when you plant a seed, say this is the ground level, and you plant a seed, and this is fertile soil. I'm going to use red, which will show up a little better. What's going to happen is you're going to get this plant that's going to grow up, and then it's going to start branching out its own roots. And these roots are going to have feeder roots. Okay, and this is a typical plant that we're talking about. And what you notice is that, we just put some really bad leaves on the top. There, the little plant growing. Lots of times what you'll notice with a plant, particularly when it's young, its root system is actually growing much faster than the top. And in a natural, you can go on the internet and you can search for time-lapse photography of root growth. And there's all kinds of videos out there that show this, and that these roots in a couple of week time in a normal circumstances will spread out and in many cases down on a root system that isn't a taproot system that we're just talking about normal, like maybe a sunflower or, it's something of that nature. This is the kind of development or root system you'd see. So that's the optimum, that a small plant will actually be able to search out and form those relationships in the soil and create a web of root systems to feed itself. Then it begins to grow its vegetative growth on top of the soil. And many times what you're looking at is this is going to be going on while you're thinking your plant's not doing much of anything at all. It's really growing. So when we look at this as a principle of it, this is the optimum from a seed started naturally in soil. So that when we, as growers, what we do is we say, well, there's a lot of variability when it comes to this. And the variability is that, well, not all seeds, when they're sown directly in the ground, will germinate. Leaving gaps and spaces in my rows and things of that nature, or not all seeds are equally viable or equally energetic or vigorous. And so you'll get some plants that just don't perform very well at all. So we compensate for getting rid of those inefficiencies, as we like to see it, by saying, okay, we will start our own transplants, and then we will only put into the ground out in the field those plants that we think are growing the most vigorous and look the best. That's when we start trading off. So when we start saying, okay, now we're going to grow this seed, instead of growing it in the ground, we're going to put it into a container. Now, whatever that container is, this could be a soil block, this could be a plastic pot, this could be anything. But basically what we've done now is we've defined the edges of where that root system can grow, top, bottom, and side. And when the plant germinates, we get to our little plant, puts out its cotyledon leaves, its roots are going to come down, and the first thing the roots are going to do is try to seek the edge of the pot. They're going to go down, probably first, and then out to the side. And the longer they're in this little pot, the more the root systems are either going to air prune to the edge, which would be like a soil block, or they're going to hit the hard edge of a container, which could be a plug tray, and they're going to bend back in on themselves, or they're going to grow. If they're air pruned, they'll typically stop. But honestly, what we're doing here is we're trading off the efficiency of getting rid of our gaps in the field and getting rid of non-vigorous plants by constraining that root system in its earliest stage, when we know in a natural world that the plant, when looking like a small plant, is actually forming in the ground in a good fertile soil a good root system. We're telling its root system, no, stand by, either stop growing or wrap around itself, continue to grow, and form a very dense mat inside of a plug cell. The longer you leave it in a plug, the more it'll wrap around. So we're trading off optimum root growth for optimum spacing and optimum what we think is vigor. Now, this does not obviously, damage the plant in the long term all the time. But the longer the root systems are either constrained from growing while the top continues to try to grow, you're going to compensate for that with extra fertilization, and you're going to probably compensate it with more watering, because the root systems themselves are not performing to how they should be in nature. That's the trade-off. So principles when it comes back to this is, think about this always, is the optimum is a root system that spreads as wide as genetically the plant can do it and takes up the minerals and nutrients it needs effectively from good fertile soil, or the trade-off is we've decided to do this. Now this seems like, okay, it's pretty common sense. So what does that mean when you're looking at, why do you soil block versus why do we not use propagation trays? Honestly, in a soil block system, particularly like if you're using mini blocks, you're gaining efficiency, because on a 10-inch by 20-inch tray, you could put 300 charges of blocks pretty close to each other, or you could put less by leaving more space between each charge. But the point is you're being efficient with space. So if you think of the resources, it's not only that you're trying to get rid, you're trying to conserve in the field, eliminate empty spaces and wasted seeding and that sort of thing by using transplants. The next thing that comes into play is resources that you have, your time, your space, or what kind of mix, or the cost of your mix that you have to use, or the cost of trays that you have to use, or plug trays, or solid trays, or cafeteria trays, or whatever it is you decide to use. This is what drives a lot of the decisions on using much smaller blocks to germinate. And there's also some data that says on a smaller block, germination tends to be faster. Now, I've never seen that as being absolutely true, but theoretically, I think it has more to do because it's easier to control humidity and temperature and things of that nature to get a better germination. Why do we soil block instead of using plug trays? The benefit for us is part of it is we don't like to use any more plastic on the farm than we have to. And in this day and age, plastic is unfortunately part of growing things. But we found that the soil block itself can be just as good, or in some cases better, in terms of germination rates for us in our system using a mini block rather than a 288 tray. And the actual planting of or bumping up of our mini block is much easier to do than trying to pry the plug out of a plastic tray. So those are the reason. I mean, if you notice that when people are doing lots of plug trays, they typically have some kind of jig in which they set the tray down to pop out those plugs. It's just extra steps that we don't need to take. So we looked at it as we use our own custom mix, soil mix, and we use soil blocks because it eliminates some extra step.
Okay, so the next question is, what is the soil mix? What is the recipe that we use for making our soil blocks?
So what you want to know is the 11 herbs and spices of the secret original recipe. Okay, we did a video on our soil mini block mix a couple of years ago, and basically at that time we were making our own mix from scratch, and we used a really fine sifted peat moss. We either sifted it ourselves using like a 1/4 inch mesh screen, or if we had access to it, we were buying already pre-sifted stuff that would be propagation grade, so it's already pre-sifted. And we would take where we've evolved to since then is we're looking at a couple of principles to make a good block. And the number one thing is, besides peat, is you want to have something in there that gives it pore space. And what we are using is what's called, I think it's plug grade perlite, which basically what it is it's sifted perlite that's down to probably a size, it's like a 1/16 of an inch type. It's really fine, and if it's dry, it can be kind of dusty, so you got to be careful with that. What we're trying to do is get a block that has good water retention. That's what the peat or the coir would be for, and good air pore space, which is what the perlite's for.
And the last one is that it needs to expand a little bit.
Yeah, that is really what the peat does is it kind of has a little bit of a memory to it that once you charge it, with your soil blocker down, and you fill the individual soil cells in the blocker, and then you release it, there's a little bit of memory, if that's the right word, but a little bit of loft comes back, maybe like 1% or something, but that's enough to help form some pore spaces, because what you want to be successful for germination is you want to have some air in that block. You don't want it to be totally saturated with water, in which case it can go anaerobic in it because there's no air spaces at all. So even though the block looks really wet, what you don't want is you don't want a block that's soupy. You want the material moist enough, and we'll show that in our next video. And it's also been shown in some of our other videos how we block. But it's basically that it's got moisture in it, but it also isn't so saturated that it's basically like liquid mud. You want it to have some structure to it so that when you do block it, it stays in its shape and it re-expands itself back up.
But when it stays in that shape, it's not compacted.
No, it's not compacted.
So that when it's charged and it's sitting there, I can see that it sort of lifts when it's time for me to seed it. So I know the soil block itself will hold, but it's not compacted. The seed will be able to send roots down.
Right. So a couple of things that we've changed in the mix since we did that video that I think have improved it a bit is the first is we dropped putting in rock dust type amendment into mini blocks. Partly because two things. First, we don't grow on for a long period of time in the mini blocks, so we're talking about something that, from germination to getting to the point where we bump it up, it could be as short as 2 weeks or depending on germination time. But usually it ends up being, a fairly short period of time. We transplant or bump up, I should say, when the plant gets to its first true set of leaves.
And most of those are, the longest is about 4 weeks.
Right.
Lysianthus, we even bump those up pretty fast even when you can barely see them.
There are some things that have a long germination period, like a yarrow or something of that nature, in which case it does go a little longer, but there's no real root activity going on in there at that point. So that's kind of aside from the point. But what we're talking about here is we eliminated those rock dusts, soft rock phosphate or green sand or that thing in a mini block because it really probably wasn't providing anything for the plant itself. And that because it takes biology for those things to put those things into a plant available form, and it's really just not there long enough probably to get effective use. And that a foliar feed or a fertilization and the watering of irrigation will probably deliver more of those micronutrients to the plant than they would be able to naturally get from what's in the mix itself. And so that's why we dropped that. We do, when we're making our own mix, do add in some dolomitic limestone, but that's basically for pH buffering because peat unto itself tends to be acidic. So the recipe is this. Got your pencil? Here we go. 4 parts of peat or coir, 1 part of the fine perlite, and this is all by volume, and a 1/2 part of finely sifted worm castings, so that there's and any of these things, there's no oversized material in it. Because the worst thing in the world when you want to do a blocker is to run into a stick or something of that nature, and it just kind of really makes it difficult. So there's no coarse material of any kind that'll mat down or anything of that nature. So it's all pretty much fine materials. And it's the perlite in the mix that for us gives it the loft and the pore space. The peat provides the water retention, and the vermicast provides available nutrients to the plant, and that's kind of our basic.
So the last thing they ask is, then what do I do to cover the seed? And I use vermiculite. There's two versions of that.
Yeah, you can get them in various grades. There's probably more than 2, but there's 2 that our supplier carries as a very coarse grade, which is something that is almost the size of like your small dinky fingernail type stuff. It's fairly large, coarse. And then there's another one that's sifted to very fine, and on the soil blocks you use the fine.
I use the fine one. It's just a sprinkling on the top of the block for most things that require light covering or that I'm worried about an algae problem on the soil block. So I will just sprinkle a light dusting of the fine vermiculite to cover it. For the larger one, for like sunflowers, which need to be covered, they need to be in the dark, I will use the larger one because
And that's again mostly for water retention.
Yep.
And prevention of any kind of like algae growth or anything.
It doesn't need to be soil and then vermiculite. I just sprinkle vermiculite over the whole thing. So that's the last ingredient we use when we're soil blocking.
Now, some folks have said, wait a minute, you were talking about a grade that was made by Promix called B grade. Or in some cases, some people were using a grade they called FPX, which I think is more of a vermiculite mix of
that
material.
question that I got specific was I can't find the FPX, and their recommended GPX, which is also sold out. So what are the ingredients, ratios, and factors for a germination mix if you can't find the FPX?
Yeah, vermiculite in our we tried vermiculite instead of perlite in our mix, and what we found is we didn't get the loft back, after we charged it, and it made a denser plug than what we were seeking, and so that's why we went with the perlite instead of a vermiculite base. Now, there are advantages to having some vermiculite in the mix. Again, it may also help with inhibiting moss or algae growth or something of that nature. So I'm not sure, we haven't tried it, but it's an interesting experiment maybe to put a small part of vermiculite in the mix, not thinking it's going to impact the loft too much. Particularly if you've got the perlite in there. But we also ran into the same problem, because for a while when we found the B mix, which was basically fine sifted peat moss, pH balanced, plus the fine grade perlite, it was like, wow, that took out a bunch of steps we didn't have to do anymore. And that worked great until last year when the pandemic hit, and for whatever reason, Promix is having difficulty in providing all the various grades, at least in our area. And it sounds like it's also happening in other areas of the country that was available before. So
a trade-off with coir.
Yeah, and that is a possibility too. We've never used coir, but heard people do it quite successfully. And again, if it has the same characteristics, the only thing about coir that I've heard is something like if you're using it raw, it needs to be rinsed. I'm not really certain on it because I haven't done any research on it, but there is a potential issue with high pH or salts in coir. So that you might do some research on if that's the avenue you want to take to use. It certainly looks like it could perform as well. And
so then one more, there's a couple more questions. There is no specific benefit of using a mini block over a 1.5. Like, things don't just automatically work better in a mini block.
No, okay, maybe the question really, it wasn't the question, or another one, it was like that, kind of in the same thing, was, well, why don't you just plant directly into like a larger block instead of using the mini block? Again, this gets back to our context. Our area for germination is very small, and so we want to get as much throughput through as possible.
Fast as possible.
And two things that always happen with seeds is, number one, very rare that you get seed that is always 100% germination, or even if you get 100% germination, that 100% or that all of those seedlings are just the most vigorous, robust seedlings you want to see put out in your field. So there are losses along the way. And if you're using a larger block, like a 1.5 inch block, or a larger plug tray, or 72s or something of that nature, and you're planting smaller seeds into those things, you're either going to have to do one or two things to compensate for the duds. Overseed the individual cells, meaning you're putting in multiples, which at some point you're going to have to come back and deal with the extra seedlings in that. Or two, you're just going to accept the fact that you're going to have to need about 20% more space and mix and trays or whatever it is you're using to accommodate the fact that you're going to have these percentage of things that are duds. And I think the major advantage for us besides space is the fact that we eliminate those losses. We don't build those losses into growing on in larger cells. And it's, you know, some cases like stock, we get like 97% and it's all good, you know, so the losses are very low. But then there are some other things like poppies that are
really
or
tricky.
asters that are like tricky, and you know, you may end up with a 65-70% good out of it. And
And
so
the asters, sometimes that's really good.
and then sometimes, I mean, for us, now that's, you
That
know,
could
can always be, you
be-
can always enhance those kinds of performance things with, say, okay, let's take it up another step and get an actual germination chamber, which we don't use. Okay, that would maybe enhance things more. Also, too, the age of your seed. If you're trying to, you know, cut the edges a little bit and you're saying, well, I still got all this aster seed left from last year and I'll just use that.
Yeah,
Well,
be careful
the
on
viability
that kind of
of
thing.
seed, even if you're storing it well,
Yeah,
goes
perfect.
down year by
And
year.
asters are really hard to get past a year.
Yeah, but
Maybe two.
there's some truth to these things. Is some seed you can get multiple years out, a couple of years out of it, and you do fine.
Dianthus, 10 years.
Yeah, other seed, you know, has like a 1-year viability.
Delphinium.
Or delphiniums and larkspurs, they're measured in months.
Yeah.
Okay,
And that's in optimum storage.
right. So you have to take that into account. If you're using older seed, those numbers I'm talking about, you know, having like 30% deads or 20% deads, it could be way worse. So
So it might not be just you that, you know, it's having a problem. I kind of take it personally, but sometimes it's not you. If you're trying to squeak out another
yeah.
year out of seed.
Oh, we've also noticed too that even on new seed that it seems like the seed suppliers are pretty stressed. And you may have noticed that you have delays in terms of getting your seed order fulfilled. And in some cases, package sizes aren't what they used to be, or, you know, all kinds of things. But one of the things we have noticed is that germination rates on some things have gone down. And that also, you know, gets back to, again, space, resources, time. You know, so yeah, you trade off maybe more time because you're bumping, but then again,
I got a better product because I got it.
at some point you got to pay the piper in terms
So,
of,
right.
of, you know, it's the trade-off thing again. So for us, our context makes a much more sense with space and with resources of purchasing more materials who make blocks that don't do anything. We avoid those things. And so that's kind of where we go.
Another question was, how does this all compare with moving towards wind strips?
You know, we haven't experimented with those yet, but I have heard very good things. And I have a lot of respect for the accomplishments that Connor Crickmore has made. And he moved full scale into these things after doing soil blocks for a number of years. And he, you know, I think he's actually, his company, Never Sink Tool, now is found a source, or somehow now has a source to sell these things.
But it's all about his efficiency.
But it's about efficiency, and it is efficient in the sense that you get the same performance of air pruning the roots at the bottom of these Winstrip trays as you do like for soil blocks. And so the quality of the transplant is still is very good from that perspective, but you gain the speed and the efficiency of how to fill it like a plug tray. So you eliminate the, you know, stamping them out and all this other kind of stuff. So it moves much faster. The trays are incredibly durable. My understanding is they'll last you a lifetime if you take care of them.
But it's an investment.
But it's an investment. The last time I looked, they were like $15 a tray. They do come in varying sizes now. It used to be that they were only essentially like a 72 size, which means like a 1.5 inch block size, or maybe 2 inch block, somewhere in there, kind of a hybrid in there. But I think, yeah, if you want to make that investment, it'd certainly be something to experiment with, I think.
We just haven't.
We just haven't, at this point.
So I think that covers all of our soil block mix and the benefits, pros and cons of why we do what we do.
Yeah.
So the next topics that we got a lot of questions for was watering and fertilizing and bumping up.
Right.
And so on our next video, we're going to go out to the greenhouse again and talk about both of those topics more in depth. And
right. Why do we bump versus not direct planting in the field from a mini block
how do we
standpoint?
water these? How do we fertilize? What do we do? What fertilizer do we use?
Well, that's been an evolving thing for us too, but that'll be an interesting discussion.
But so we're going to leave this at this point with kind of our philosophy of soil blocking. And if you have more questions after we release this on soil blocking, shoot us a question. We're still coming up with questions.
Well, we also recognize too that we're sitting here at this table and we're talking, and you go, okay, great, you answered some of the questions, but
this is a lot
of stuff. And so some of the things may interest folks and others won't. So what we're going to do, since this is kind of like a little less of visual aid type videos, we're going to put what are called chapters in the description, which are basically timestamp marks that you can click on to go in to get various things. So if your only interest on this one is like, I already know all this other stuff, I just want to know what your mix is, we'll put that in there. We'll put that in there so you can go right to it, but we'll also print it out in the show description notes. So be sure to go down and look at the description notes. There's going to be some stuff in there that will be useful for you.
Right.
Oh, one last thing. Here's a nugget. We were talking about seeds. Is Pan American or the companies that broker a lot of particularly flower seeds are like Pan Americans, Cicada, Taki. Anyway, these companies they put out on the internet what they call cultural or grower fact sheets that will tell you a lot about how to plant these guys, and their focus is plug production. So it's a commercial greenhouse, plastic tray type production. But it tells you a lot of things like light levels, covering them, not covering them, temperatures best to germinate at, what kind of fertilization to use, things, all kinds of the next stages. If you are going to bump, what do you look for? What's the stage to transplant to field? All these kinds of things. So those are really good sheets, and they're free. And all you got to do is Google them.
The other place that we spend a lot of time with on the resource page from Johnny's.
Yeah.
An extremely good place to go to learn the basics, what you get off the packet, but there's also a lot of resources in their library. Yeah. So you want to check that out too.
Yeah. And I think one last comment on mixes. There's a lot of different blocking mixes out there now. That when we kind of started this, there really wasn't. And now, if you're back east and you're in reasonable distance, you can maybe buy some of this stuff from like either Vermont Composting. Johnny's sells a mix. I think they call it their 512 mix or something like that. A Gardener's Workshop sells some.
But we got lots of international people with us too.
And so
it's like...
So look for your area, because this is getting more and more popular, that there might be something in there. But, again, it goes back to the principles of think about what you want the characteristics of that mix to be.
And what's available for you.
Right. So if you don't want to mix your own, look around. There may be more. I think there are more and more companies that are beginning to go, this is something, and they're making something towards it. I think Sunshine might also in North America. They're bigger back east than they are in the west. But
no.
they may also have something too. So do your research on that, and maybe you can avoid, an extra step of labor. In our case, we're mixing now our own, simply because of just lack of works for us and lack of availability of a good mix elsewhere. So
yeah, it's all about your own context.
right. So thanks for joining us today, and as always, there will be a test on the subject matter. Now, you folks stay safe out there, and thank you everybody for submitting your questions.
Yes,
and
thank you.
We will, our next video, like she said, we're going to be out in the greenhouse, showing a little more practical stuff, so no more lectures.
No more lectures.
Okay, so have a good day, and thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.